Hey, Ezra, thank you for joining me. I'm Darren, and I'm a co-owner of Early Light Media, and you're Ezra Pailer, one of our animators.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
We're going to call this temporarily ELM Creative Today.
That sounds great to me.
We just came up with that. We were just creative together. ELM Creative Today. So today we're talking about the animation process, right? So a lot of our clients, a lot of people use animation at this point. It's not something new, but now that we're in COVID and it's a post-COVID world and we're still in COVID, animation has really come to the forefront. We hired you because we were going to boost our animation department. Even before we hired you, we had plans to do this and continue bringing on talented creators and animators and artists. But with the COVID situation, we realized it increased tenfold. You started on the day that everything shut down in Maryland. How was that?
I really did. Yeah, that was very surreal. Yeah, I had my first day in the office and then it completely moved to remote. And I think I've been accumulating pretty well as far as the animation workflow. Thankfully, it's not a workflow that's too affected by location or access to a space, as long as you have the right equipment and the materials for the most part. It doesn't really affect the process, but it's definitely been an adjustment overall, just this new climate we're living in and the way of life outside and everything.
Yeah, I've met you twice, I think, in person, but we talk every day, which is very
Yeah.
strange. That's a new COVID thing. So what I really want to break down for people is, even though animation is pretty widely used in corporate videos and films and everything else, I just want to break down the process for anyone that has any misconceptions about how animation works. So at Early Light Media, we have it's a five-step process, basically, right? So first, this is after kind of we determine that you need an animated video. But step one is scripting. Step two is concept art, style boards. Step three is storyboards. Step four is animation. Step five is delivery. So I kind of want to take kind of clients or anyone that's watching through the process of those steps and how it works, so that it's smooth and everyone kind of is on the same page. So the first step with animation is scripting, right?
Right.
So as an animator, how involved are you in that process, or are you involved? Or is that typically a writer or a producer that kicks off that process?
I think it definitely depends on the project. Like I know we've had a couple where people come to us with a script that's already been laid out, or they've already started on it, or they have a certain language for the message that they feel very strongly about. And in that case, as an animator, I take that and I think about the message and how one image will move to another to sort of carry us through that message. So that's definitely one scenario. And there's also a lot of cases where people aren't really sure where to start as far as the messaging or the story, or maybe they don't really have any set ideas of images involved in their process on their end, how they've sort of come to this conclusion of wanting an animated video. And in that case, I would kind of start from scratch and start to think about the script. And particularly with motion graphics messaging, my approach to it, I sort of think of an analogy of making a blueprint for a roller coaster, because when you're designing a roller coaster, people are having an experience with motion, and animation kind of offers the same thing. So you want to think of the arcs, and the momentum kind of has to make sense, both in terms of like the visual part of it, and also it has to work in tandem with the message. So you want to kind of hit those points of anticipation and release, and kind of consider that as like a blueprint for how the rest of it will sort of fall into place. That's
Such a
usually kind of where I start from.
That's a fantastic metaphor. I always tell people, like, dramatically, your goal with any story is to take a basketball and push it down in the water as far as you can go for that final giant release, right? Whatever that arc is.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. It kind of brought something to mind, one misconception about writing for animation. So obviously, when you're doing like documentary, for instance, you can be looser with time, right? Like you
Right.
can, an 8 or 9 minute video versus a 6 minute video. We're not talking about major changes in labor. I mean, it does change the way that you work on it, the way you think about it, but it doesn't have major labor changes. Whereas with animation, if, you know, and this goes back to scripting it to the right length, if you make it 1.5 minutes versus 2 minutes, how does that change the amount of work that goes into the project?
In terms of the workload, it's actually amazing how much it varies just by style. Like if I'm doing something in After Effects, which is more of a vector-based software where you're kind of like you're moving things around and the computer is recording that motion and kind of generating the keyframes, and then you can go back in and tweak it, you know, without having to start from scratch or anything like that. Whereas hand-drawn animation, you know, you may be drawing every single frame. So if there's a motion change you want to go back and make, or if you need to extend something a little longer, at that point it becomes more tricky and you have to be a little bit more innovative in how you approach tweaking that timing.
Right. And, you know, animation is good for a lot of purposes. It's good for covering a portion of a live action video that doesn't have a lot of, you know, video to illustrate it.
Right.
It's good for explainer videos or complicated concepts. It's also good for little professional touches on educational videos, whether it's an animated open or whatever. There's a lot of uses for it. But one of the probably the most used purposes is like an explainer video of some sort, right? And
Right.
those are typically 90 seconds, maybe 60 to 90 seconds, sometimes 2 minutes, but generally. And I think one misconception that I find a lot of clients want to do is they want to write it. They want to write the script to save money. However, I caution clients against that. I'd rather have, you know, give me talking points. What is the most important outcome that you want out of that video, and let us write it. And it's for that length reason, because, you know, anybody that's not used to writing for video doesn't understand how short 90 seconds of copy actually is and how direct you have to be. And they also have a tendency to write almost like they're writing a book, where they use very illustrative language as opposed to using the visuals to do that heavy lifting, right? Whereas, like, you know, words and visuals work together to complete the story.
Right.
And a lot of clients, I think that they can write it, but it's always either overwritten one way or the other. So that's something that's kind of come up a lot with us, I think. So let's jump into, you know, step number 2 of animation, concept art. Every story is different. There's initial ideas for character design, illustration style. Is it motion graphics? What is the difference between motion graphics and character animation, for example?
So I think that they can actually go hand in hand quite often. Like, I think explainers very often fall under the umbrella of motion graphics, and those often utilize a lot of bright and colorful characters. When I think of motion graphics, I think of more commercial messaging. I think of like explainer videos. I think of, you know, dynamic lower thirds on the news. You know, you really see motion graphics everywhere. Anytime you turn on the TV, you're going to see a lot of interesting examples of it. And character animation is definitely utilized a lot for those commercial messages, or even just other types of messages that brands or companies want to get out that aren't necessarily related to a product. It could just be, you know, a unifying message, and that characters are a great way to portray that. But I think when you go away from motion graphics into more hand-drawn styles of animation, that includes a lot more experimental and narrative animation. And narrative can be present in any form with animation, but a lot of short films, like if you are at a festival like Sweaty Eyeballs, a great animation festival that the Parkway Theater hosts in Baltimore each year, a lot of those are more short narrative films or experimental films, and they utilize more of what I would consider hand-drawn animation, or animation that's not in the motion graphics category necessarily.
That's fantastic. So, okay, so you've kind of broken down the difference between motion graphics and character animation. Talk to me a little bit about step number 2, concept art, right? So let's say we want to, you know, and a client comes to us. They're like, this is what we need to get across. Here's the script. We got the script together. Now, what do you present to the client after that?
once we're at that phase and we sort of have an idea of the script and the messaging is kind of nailed down, then I create style frames where I take a particular, image or something that might be a really good potential scene that we would have in this animation, and I create a couple variations of that. For example, maybe someone isn't quite sure if they want to have a motion graphics look or more of a hand-drawn animated look. So I can create just a single frame of imagery that would showcase the same sort of scene in those different styles. And then that way they can compare and sort of pick and choose what they like from each one, or maybe they feel really solid about a certain thing we've presented. And at that point, we would decide on what style we'd proceed in.
Right. So let me show you guys, I'm going to pull up some concept art, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Ezra, but I believe that this is, let me see here, I'm just going to share my screen. This is some concept art. Like, is this what you would share with a client to get the style together?
Yes, so this was actually character expression sheets.
Oh, cool.
We had this assignment this was for my senior thesis film at UMBC, and we had an assignment where we created these character and expression sheets to present to the class and kind of pitch these characters and the different ranges of emotion to sort of give everyone a sense of what we developed. And if someone was really specifically working with developing a character for their animation, this is definitely something that I would put together and to sort of showcase the character, especially for a longer and more involved project where there is going to be an arc of character development.
Now this is more concept art, right? This is your hand-drawn stuff. This is like what we might share with a client to say, this is the style we're going with. This is very custom, and this is obviously the more expensive approach to make something that an artist would make.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Essentially, what a style frame would be something like this, where it's just showing a concept or an image and different stylistic approaches to that.
Right. Now, what I'm going to do is I want to share with you an actual storyboard that we have from a client. And this is more simplified because this was a super fast turnaround. This is the one for a client, Pay Active. I think that they're okay with us sharing this. Let's see here. Cool. Right. So this is an actual storyboard, right? So after we send style frames along, the next step would be sending an actual storyboard. Now this one, it's very safe to say, Ezra, this is probably the fastest one you've ever put together, because this was right when COVID happened and you had a couple days to make this or something like that.
I think this one was done in a couple of hours, probably.
Yeah, which is insane how fast he was able to come up with this, and not a typical process. But so you have the style frames like we saw in the last one, like this is the style of the art. And then we have the storyboard, which is the next step, which is actually seeing, sort of matching the copy with what frames we're going to be seeing, right? And so like, what are these lines we're looking at, these red lines?
Yeah, so these are definitely typically done a bit tidier than us. They're shown here, but I add those to sort of give a sense of the motion that we will be working with. Like, for example, the arrows going out kind of show a camera zoom in, or there might be arrows drawn to sort of show how a character will be moving or how a graphic will be moving across the screen. So it just kind of starts to give you a feeling of what we have in mind for the motion at this point in the game, and we're not able to show that in a storyboard. It's more just images, but we kind of want to start in that direction to show some potentials for how things will be moving.
Yeah, that was incredible. How you were able to put that together so fast, which we generally don't want to do because it's not ideal. It's not going to get to the ideal outcome, but in this case, it was the shutdown that just occurred. And then, okay, so then we have, let me stop sharing this one. I want to go to the next step, is actual animation. So then, you know, let's say you have a 90-second animated video. You've provided the storyboards for the client. Talk about this process, what you actually do, and then how long it takes.
So interestingly enough, the actual animation itself tends to be the most straightforward process. Usually at that point, we have everything squared away with the storyboard and the messaging. And like you were talking about earlier, how people tend to maybe overwrite their messages a little bit. This is the point when we've really narrowed that down and everyone's happy with the script that we're working from. And then at that point, it's kind of just like a framework, like the analogy I made earlier of the blueprint for the roller coaster. It's like you have all the infrastructure, you're just sort of filling it in with the details. And it wildly ranges depending on the type of animation. Like the same video in a hand-drawn style could take several weeks longer than something that's done, you know, in a very clean vector motion graphic sort of style. So that definitely varies.
And the clean vector motion graphics, that's what you typically see for like a corporate video.
Definitely. A lot of the explainer
characters.
Yeah, they take on that style.
Now, is that like a month? Is it 2 months? Like what's kind of from start to finish in terms of, I guess it might be a couple months for, you know, all the steps, but like, you know, for the animation portion, is that like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
I think for, let's say, a minute-long video, it could range from, you know, 3 days to a week, especially if there's characters. I think, you know, that tends to make it longer. If there's character rigging or a lot of character animation, that can take it much closer to a week in length. But if it's mostly graphics or icons, or we're using assets from another source like the client, or we've sourced assets and we're just breaking those up for animation, in that case, it can definitely be done in a couple days, just the animation part.
Fantastic. I'm going to share my screen here of your thesis film, which is so cool. It was like when we saw this, we were like, we got to get this guy. And I'll send, I don't know if you guys can actually hear this, I don't know if it's recording, but I'll actually send a link to this where you can actually go watch it afterwards. So Ezra, now we've done, you know, all this stuff. We've done the concept boards, script, the storyboards, the actual animation we deliver it. Talk a little, really briefly before we have to go, about your actual creative process. I mean, like watching, you know, Willow, it's just so cool. What are, you know, when we have a client, they want to do X, what's your first thing? Do you start drawing? Do you start, how do these ideas come out of your head?
So for this film in particular, I was really inspired by my experiences growing up in a more rural part of Maryland and sort of the magic that those landscapes have always held for me. And this one is actually quite emotional. It's about my favorite tree from my childhood that got cut down, and sort of a visual way to process the grief in that and kind of acknowledge that we do have these really important relationships with things that aren't just people, with land, with features of land. So I really wanted to explore that with this. And that kind of usually informs my process on a larger film like this, is the emotional experience that I want to share with people. And I think animation is such a powerful tool for that, because, you know, with any creative medium, you're sort of doing this personal magic of having something in your head and then manifesting it to something other people can experience. And I think there's a lot of power in getting that imagery from the outer world, but there's also a lot of power in starting from scratch and kind of pulling it out of yourself. So usually to sort of go into that process, I actually like to just sort of meditate or take a walk. Something I do is I'll often create a playlist, sometimes of ambient music, sometimes of, you know, different songs that really kind of put me into a certain headspace. And then I'll just take a really long walk while kind of ruminating in those feelings, and sort of start to just think of scenes or imagery that suit those feelings. And that's certainly kind of how I started with this one here.
It is so beautiful. I mean, the way, the detail and the kite and everything, it's really incredible. The faces are so haunting.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Well, Ezra, I will send a link to this so people can actually take some time to watch it and appreciate it for the art that it is. Thank you for meeting me here. You know, we talk every day, but it's good to actually sit down and, you know, hear your thoughts on how you work and life.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Talk soon. Cool. Oh, I didn't.